Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the fascinating, highly dramatic, and honestly hilariously exaggerated world of human hyperbole. You know, we humans just have this unique, undeniable talent for blowing things completely out of proportion. And throughout history, well, we've developed some incredibly colorful ways to describe this exact behavior. So we're going to look at the origins, the evolution, and some amazing global variations of one of our absolute favorite ways to say, hey, you are overreacting.
So, let me ask you a seemingly bizarre question to kick things off. Have you ever turned a fly into an elephant? Now, you're probably thinking, what on earth does that even mean? But this quirky little question actually holds the secret to a 500-year-old linguistic mystery. Plus, it completely opens the door to understanding how we process exaggeration across entirely different cultures.
The truth is, we all have this natural, almost uncontrollable tendency to overreact. I mean, think about it. You stub your toe, and for a second, it is literally the worst pain in the history of the world, right? Or you get one bad grade and suddenly your entire future is ruined. The English language captures this dramatic flair perfectly with the classic idiom to make a mountain out of a molehill. It just means taking a tiny, completely unimportant issue and treating it like some massive, insurmountable problem.
Now, tracking down exactly where this phrase comes from is just fascinating, starting with the word mole itself. If we rewind all the way back to Old English, a mole was actually called a wand or a want, and a molehill, well, that was known by the fantastic little word wantatump. I mean, how great is that? By Middle English, this evolved into moldwarp, which literally translates to earth thrower. Eventually, moldwarp got shortened to moley, and finally, we arrived at the modern English mole. We basically had to get the word mole locked into the language first before we could even start making mountains out of their little piles of dirt.
And that actually brings us to the year 1548. This is the very first time our famous phrase pops up in written English. It was penned by a 16th century English playwright and translator named Nicholas Udall. While translating a religious text, he wrote, "The sophists of Greece could, through their copiousness, make an elephant of a fly and a mountain of a molehill." It has a really wonderful rhythm to it, doesn't it? But here's where the story gets just a bit mischievous.
See, Udall was translating a work that referenced a much older 2nd century Greek text by a writer named Lucian, and Lucian's original text only ever used the phrase, make an elephant of a fly. That was it. The mountain part wasn't there at all. But when Udall got his hands on it, he gave it a pretty massive creative upgrade. He didn't just translate the elephant and fly metaphor, he completely invented the mountain and molehill edition out of thin air. Why? Well, as a playwright, he clearly just loved a good, punchy alliteration. Those M sounds in mountain and molehill just roll right off the tongue.
But actually, there might be a deeper, slightly more political reason behind Udall's sudden burst of creativity. You see, Udall was commissioned to oversee this translation by Catherine Parr, who was the final wife of King Henry VIII. He wrote this in 1548, which was just 1 year after the very imposing King Henry had passed away. A lot of literary historians believe this witty addition of making a mountain out of a molehill was Udall's subtle, maybe slightly cheeky nod to the larger-than-life king. Henry VIII was, after all, a monarch totally famous for making sweeping, historic changes, like, creating an entirely new church out of his own personal grievances. He was kind of the ultimate architect of turning molehills into mountains.
Taking a step back to the academic side for a second, what's actually happening in our brains when we use these phrases? Based on linguistic research into the mechanics of hyperbole, experts note that making a mountain out of a molehill isn't just lying. It's a deliberate exaggeration of reality used specifically for persuasive or comic effect. And what I find most fascinating is that it requires what they call a joint acceptance of distorted reality. When I tell you someone is making a mountain out of a molehill, you know I don't literally mean tectonic plates are shifting in their backyard. We both agree to accept this distorted reality so we can understand the emotional truth of the situation. It's a clever linguistic tool used to legitimize claims or just add some dramatic flair.
Okay, so remember that bizarre question I asked you at the very beginning about the fly and the elephant? Well, here is where it finally makes total sense. While English speakers eventually settled on mountains and molehills, thanks entirely to Nicholas Udall, the rest of the world actually leans heavily into the original Greek phrasing. All over the globe, from the Dutch to German, Russian, Italian, all the way to Uzbek, the standard way to describe someone overreacting is to accuse them of turning a tiny fly, or maybe a mosquito, into a giant elephant. The imagery is just universally understood, right? Small annoyance becomes a massive beast.
But wait, some cultures take this creative exaggeration so much further. I mean, if you think an elephant is good, in Armenian, if you complain too much, you're making a camel out of a louse. In Romanian, you're turning a mosquito into a galloping stallion. The Finnish will accuse you of making a little ox out of a fly, and in Turkish, you're spinning a tiny flea into a giant camel. These are just brilliant examples of how every culture finds its own hilarious way to call out dramatic overreactions using the animals that are most familiar to them.
I absolutely love these unique variations too. The Welsh, for instance, take a slightly different approach. They might say you're making a sea and a mountain out of something, or getting incredibly specific, making a mountain out of an anthill. Meanwhile, the Spanish and the French, they ditch the animals in the dirt entirely. If you're panicking over something trivial in Madrid or Paris, they'll just tell you that you are drowning in a glass of water. It is such a wonderfully visual, slightly dramatic way to describe totally unnecessary panic.
You might be wondering, though, why animals? Why do so many of these phrases lean so heavily on the animal kingdom? Well, it ties perfectly back to ancient traditions, like Aesop's fables. For thousands of years, all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome, storytellers have used these dramatic contrasts in animal sizes. Think the tiny mouse and the huge lion, the slow tortoise and the fast hare, or our friend the fly and the elephant. They use them to teach us lessons about our own foolish human behaviors. Using nature's scale is just a timeless way to reflect our own psychological exaggerations right back at us.
Fast forward to today, and this 500-year-old English phrase is still incredibly relevant. Just look at this recent quote from the Los Angeles Times, which highlights how the media constantly uses this phrase to describe everyday social dynamics. It talks about that really delicate balancing act we all face. How do you address a real issue, like an unintended slight or a microaggression, without seeming overly dramatic? Nobody wants to be accused of making a mountain out of a molehill. So the phrase itself acts as a sort of social regulator, keeping our reactions in check.
And of course, it's absolutely everywhere in the legal and political spheres too. Like in a recent courtroom case covered by the LA Times, where a defense attorney claimed the other side was trying to make a mountain out of a molehill by building a case on guesswork instead of hard evidence. Whether we're talking about a courtroom or a political debate, public figures are absolute masters of the politics of distraction. They regularly take tiny molehills of evidence and blow them up into terrifying mountains just to capture our attention. Or conversely, they accuse their opponents of doing exactly that. It's an incredibly powerful rhetorical weapon.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I've got a challenge for you. Take a look at your own life, today. Look at the news you consume. When was the last time you, or a politician, or your favorite news source, took a tiny wanta dump, a little molehill, and turned it into a massive mountain? Who is out there right now, drowning in a glass of water, or turning a mosquito into a stallion? Keep an eye out for it, because I promise you, once you realize how often we exaggerate reality, you're going to see those elephants flying absolutely everywhere. Thanks for learning with me today on The Explainer.